This evening, Middleway Words has a very special feature to mark Armistice Day. With me is Alistair Price, who has written a book about the remarkable story of his father, Wing Commander Kenneth Price, DFC and Bar. Wing Commander Price joined the RAF in 1939 and flew 58 missions as a navigator on Lancaster bombers, defying the odds of survival in one of World War II's most dangerous theatre of operations. He was shot down and captured by the Germans in 1943. As a prisoner of war, he then took part in one of the best known and one of the most infamous episodes of the conflict's later years. It truly is an extraordinary story. And if you'd like to ask Alistair any questions, pop them on a message in the chat box and we'll get around to as many of them as we can at the end. Welcome, Alistair. Could you start us off by telling us a little more about your father's wartime exploits?
Thank you, Mark. Yes, I will. My father was an identical twin boy. He was born in October 1919, which makes me a certain age, I'm afraid. And he joined the Coventry Evening Telegraph in 1937. He and his brother were Warwickshire table tennis champions in the 30s. Father joined, as I said, Coventry Evening Telegraph, and then he joined the RAF Reserve at Anstey, which is quite near Coventry, in September 1938. And he did that because he knew a war was coming and he wanted to preempt being told which service he wanted to go. He always wanted to join the RAF. Everybody wanted to be pilots, but my father was particularly interested in meteorology and maps, so he wanted to become a navigator. So he joined the RAF Reserve. He, as you rightly said in the introduction, he was posted to join the RAF in 1939, and he flew in the Battle of Britain, in Blenheims, which were absolutely useless. They were night fighters, allegedly. They did 120 miles an hour, and they were the German Luftwaffe Me-109s, which were very, very good aircraft, could outmaneuver them. They could do over 300 miles an hour. And the Bristol Blenheim was known as a flying coffin. And I got this from somebody who's Flight Lieutenant Colin Bell, who's still alive today, who's 102, who told me anybody who flew in these aircraft was risking their lives big time. Father did 58 trips. The life expectancy for aircrew in Bomber Command was 5 trips. So aircrew were their attrition rate was greater than officers in World War One. So how the hell I'm here, I don't know. Anyway, as I say, he did 58 trips. Every experience was frightening. And on the 27th of July 1943, he was the then squadron leader, navigating officer at Witton in Huntingdonshire in Pathfinders. Pathfinders led the bombers in over Germany. So my father was responsible. So he'd risen up the ranks pretty quickly. And one of his Canadian navigators came to him and said, "Hey, squadron leader, I've met a young lady tonight. Could I be let off flying on a trip to Essen?" Father said, "Well, actually, I can't find anybody else." But for the first time in his life, he flew in a Mosquito. And he said, "I'll take your trip," because the Mosquito was at the time the fastest aircraft of both the Axis, which was the German Air Force, and the Allied Air Force. They could fly higher, faster than any other aircraft. They did a reconnaissance trip over Duisburg, and unfortunately on the way back over Holland, they were hit by flak, which was guns from below. And they, unfortunately, the aircraft, because it was fast, and it was made of wood, and it was just very inflammable. So the aircraft caught fire. The pilot had to turn the aircraft over so that the pilot could get out through the canopy. My father also had to get out. Unfortunately, he caught his leg on the tail fin and parachuted to ground. Fortunately, he was okay. He was on the run for 7 days. He was then picked up by the resistance, The resistance wrongly got rid of his dog tags, because even today they have 2 dog tags, one for the body and one to send via the Red Cross back home. And they put him in a peasant's uniform. They got rid of his RAF uniform. They then put him in a Catholic church for safety, and the Catholic priest got scared and shopped him to the Gestapo, who were nasty pieces of work. And the Gestapo said he's a spy, because pre-war, and I only learned this recently, youngsters were taught to speak German, not French or Spanish. It was taught to speak German. So my father was relatively good at German, but they thought he was a spy. They beat him up, they broke his ribs, and they took him out to be shot. Obviously they didn't, because I'm here, but they had blanks in the guns. Eventually, he was rescued. I say rescued, slightly euphemistically, because the rescuer was an alleged Luftwaffe officer. I say alleged because what they wanted to do was put him at ease and see what they could get out of him, because his name, rank, and number was officially in the Geneva Convention, was all they were required to give over if they were made prisoners of war. And what happened was, this Luftwaffe officer was, I've learnt in 1947, was actually an Romanian SS officer in disguise who could speak very good English, and he put him at ease. But anyway, father was rescued from the Gestapo, went to Stalag Luft, which was a transit camp where he was in hospital for 2 weeks recovering from his broken ribs. He then went to Stalag Luft III in Sargon in Poland, where he was incarcerated from the end of August 1943 until the end of January 1945. That was a horrible time. He was in the camp, as I say, for about 18 months. I've got lots of cards home which I've put in the book about his experience, and he took part in the Great Escape. So there were squadron leader Roger Bushell, who organized the Great Escape. Father was on the committee. So there were 200 that were due to come out on the 24th of March 1944. Dad was 182, and out of a tunnel called H for Harry. And what happened was, they had radios in the camp, and they hadn't alerted the home UK to the fact that we were doing this big escape. So the British RAF decided to bomb a local marshalling yard, train yard, and of course all the lights went off, and all these poor guys in a tunnel 350 foot long were shed in darkness. So then they had to slow down the escape. They planned the escape I think it was every 3 minutes, and they were in the tunnel from 8:30 to 9:30 in the evening. Couldn't get out because the tunnel exit was frozen. And so eventually the lights came back on at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and they took a decision that they would only get a maximum of 100 out. So father had to get back in his RAF uniform, which a new RAF uniform that come from the Red Cross in Geneva, and they got 76 out eventually. Of those 76, 3 got back to the UK, 2 were Norwegian, and they were lucky because a lot of Norwegians were used as laborers by the Germans, and 1 was Danish. On Hitler's orders, the other 73 were all due to be shot. Interestingly, Himmler and Göring, Himmler was in charge of the SS, a nasty piece of work as well, and Göring in charge of the Luftwaffe, said, well, actually, you can't shoot them all because they're also going to shoot the camp commandant, Lindner, von Lindner. And they decided, Hitler said, right, I want 50 shot. So randomly, they shot 50. 23 got back to camp and 3 got home. Of those 50, not one was injured. Not one was injured. And what the Gestapo did, they interviewed them, said, right, we're taking you back to Stalag Luft III in Sargon. And on the way back to the camp, they took them out and said, you can have a toilet break now. And whilst they were having a toilet break, they were shot in the back of the head. And every one of those guys was then cremated. So after the escape, the camp commandant was interviewed by the senior British officer, Commander Massey, Wing Commander Massey, and they said, well, we accept that you're going to shoot people if they try and escape, but how come there's nobody injured? And they couldn't answer that. And the Germans did it so there would be no evidence. Yeah. Very, very poignant. My father, I've seen articles which is in the book as well. Dad and his fellow colleagues felt really guilty that he and the other 130 potential escapers had got off free. That being said, the Germans didn't let off those guys either, because what they did, when the Germans found out about the escape, they found the hut, they took all the guys out, stripped them down to their underpants, and made them stand in snow and ice for 4 hours, -20. And how nasty was that? So father, it was a very harrowing experience for Dad, yeah, wouldn't wish it on anybody. No. Eventually, I have a card from him when he was in camp saying that December 1944 was the worst time he'd ever experienced in his life. There's a censor. They had 100 female censors in the camp who put a black line through any cards. They were allowed to send 100 cards home per month, but eventually they weren't getting home because they had to go via Switzerland and then back home, and that took 3 months to get any of these cards of correspondence back home. And then he eventually, at the end of January 1945, the Russians, that's fairly high profile at the moment, were 20 miles from the camp. So the prisoners of war didn't know whether they were going to be shot, used as human shields. So eventually the Germans marched them away from the east to the west, and then back and forth. So over nearly 3 months, they did 500 miles. During that period of time, a lot lost their lives. There was a scarcity of food, and initially it was still -20 with snow on the ground, and the malnutrition was dreadful. They had to drink snow, and unfortunately, the prisoners have been using the snow as a urination place, so that wasn't very, very helpful either. And they were shot up by RAF Typhoons who thought they were prisoners of war. And eventually, on the 8th of May 1945, they met a Canadian army group. Sorry, they met an army group from Cheshire. And my father's written a letter saying I could have kissed the captain of this army group when he arrived. My father was eventually repatriated to the UK at the beginning of June 1945. He married my mother in 21st of June 1946, who was a WAF, i.e. a lady in the RAF, but she was a corporal. And they had me in 48, and father then joined the Ministry of Defence, and sadly he died in 1980, very young, very, very young, not only 60, and it was due mainly to his time in prisoner of war camp. So that, Mark, is a summary of my father's experience and a little tidbits on the book.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary story. It really is. It's that any one man could be involved in so much that was key. The Long March and the Great Escape, and
yes,
and all the. It's your father very much belonged to a generation that didn't speak much of what happened in the war during peacetime. So how much of his story were you aware of before you started to write this book?
In truth, in retrospect, and having spoken to your good self, I wish I'd spoken to him and talked to him about it. But like many of his generation, they didn't talk about the war. They didn't. No. They kept it under wraps. And everything I put in the book is from papers that I found at my mother's home. Mother died at the age of 94 in May 2017, and I dug through all the papers and put the whole thing together, and it was quite an emotional experience. And as you know, as I say, I really wish I'd had the opportunity and the maturity to discuss it with him. I always remember I used to drink in a local pub with my father, which was great. And we met a guy who was a machine gunner in the First World War. And he said to my father, "How did you feel about bombing civilians?" And he said, I was told to murder, murder German soldiers coming over with my machine gun. How did you feel about bombing civilians? And father wouldn't answer. He said, "We did what we would. That was our order, and you had to put it out of your mind. Otherwise, you'd have been taken off bomber crew." I mean, there were 38,000 bomber crew killed in the war, and they were all volunteers.
Yeah.
So in answer to your question, Mark, I wish I'd had more time with him. Even now thinking about it, it's very poignant for me.
Absolutely. And well, it wasn't until long after your father died that there was a permanent memorial to Bomber Command. Such was the lingering effect of a distaste.
Down the Marble Arch opposite RAF Club.
Yeah, it's fabulous memorial. I've been down there myself. It's a wonderful mark, but that was only in recent years.
It's interesting. It's interesting because Churchill would not recognise Bomber Command as being key in the war against Germany. So after the war, they didn't have any recognition at all. It's only in the last 5 years that I, on behalf of my father, have got a little clasp that says recognises his time during the Second World War in Bomber Command and what he did for it as well.
Yeah, indeed. You mentioned you had a huge resource of material to work through from that your mother had kept all those years. And how did you go about sorting through that? You know, you're dealing with the emotional effect of looking through your father's life. How do you go through sorting it all and forming it into a book?
Initially, well, I've had this vision of writing a book on my father because he and I were good mates. But when Mum died in May 2017, we found 3 boxes at home, quite large boxes of papers, cuttings, photographs. And that was the one advantage of COVID for me, because we were all not allowed out unless it was for a walk or whatever. I disciplined myself at the beginning. It was about beginning of 2021 to go through. I spend 2 or 3 hours a day just going through all the papers, reading everything, and then I went through it all again, putting it in chronological order. And then I started writing what I'd seen and read. So the papers were the basis of my book. That being said, I also took the opportunity to interview people who I knew had been in Stalag Luft III as well. So in October 2017, I interviewed a gentleman called Flight Lieutenant Jack Lyons in Eastbourne. He was 100 years old, and bless him, he saluted me. And I said, "You don't need to salute me. My father was," he said, "because your father was squadron leader and I'm only a flight lieutenant." And hey ho, he was 78 to come out of the tunnel. He gave me an hour and a half of his time. So a lot of what he gave me was very different to what my father had experienced. He was in a Manchester, which is a twin engine, very slow bomber, which crashed in Germany in 1940. And in those days, the Germans would pick up the crew and they took them for a drink, gave them food, and then put him in camp. So his experience early on was a lot less than my father, but he gave me a lot of background information to what life was like in Stalag Luft III. Officers weren't required to work. Now, when my father was shot down in 1943, very different. The Germans and Goebbels, particularly the propaganda minister, said any flyer shot down is going to, I want the civilian population. We don't have any sympathy with them. They murder them. Fortunately, my father was picked up by the Germans, and so that's how he survived. But quite a number, sadly, were murdered. I've also met Captain Vivian Howard, who was he too was 100, and that was the beginning of last year, January 2021. He was a Fleet Air Arm guy. So why was a Fleet Air Arm guy in an RAF camp? Well, the reason was the Germans said he was a flyer, but I interviewed him and he gave me some stories of Stalag Luft III as well. I've also, I didn't actually interview him, and this is one of the things you should do in life, take advantage of the opportunities. I interviewed, I was going to interview a chap called Wing Commander Charles Clark, whom I met in March 2019 at the 75th anniversary of the Great Escape. And he said to me, "Oh, young man," I like the young man bit. He said, "You know how old I am? You contacted me 2 years ago, didn't you?" And I said, "Yes, I'd like to hear your views on." He was in Stalag Luft III, but not in the Great Escape. And he said, "Well, you know how old I am. When we get back, give us a ring." So I phoned 2 weeks after we got back in early April 2019 to speak to a lady and we're told he died. So do things now. But there is another chap I've also interviewed. And so the second publishing of him, I've added some of the things that he's given me, is Flight Lieutenant Colin Bell. Colin Bell's now 102, and he flew Mosquitoes in the Battle of Britain. And it was he who said to me, the reason the attrition rate was so great in bombers was because the Lancaster bomber, had no ventral guns underneath the fuselage. So the Germans at night would come underneath the bombers and just take them out. So, you know, the aircrew, my father in particular, I've seen written, you know, they didn't know they were going to be blown to pieces, burnt alive, or just shot down immediately. And that was down to Arthur Bomber Harris, who was in charge of Bomber Command, who said, "We want radar, we do not want under fuselage guns." So, and he's still alive today, bless him. He's a lovely man. So that's some of the background. So it's interviewing people and going through all the papers that my mother had put together.
How did you track these people down, by the way, the veterans?
I talk to journalists. Journalists are always very useful point of information.
Fabulous people.
I did some research. I talked to people. I know people at the RAF club. I've seen articles on various things, and I either track them down, ring them, or just knock on their door. And it's part of the research thing, and because it's interesting. It's like I'm hoping, which in a third edition or fourth edition of the book, I've been invited to Whitton in Huntingdonshire, where my father was based, and it's not a public site, but the curator there said we'd be very welcome. You'd be most welcome to come over and see what your father was in and talk about the unit and what they did and what they're doing there now. So yeah, if I found somebody, I'd track them down. I haven't tracked down everybody because sadly, you know, most of them will be over 100. Dad would have been 104 now, so difficult to track them down, unfortunately.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. You know, when you were going through everything about your father's life, and you know, referring back to the fact that you didn't get to ask him all the questions you wanted to while he was alive, was there anything you found in the research that took you by surprise?
Took me by surprise. Yes, two things actually. One was when Dad was shot down on the 27th of July 1943. His identical twin brother was based in Iceland in Coastal Command. My father always felt that was a cushy number because Coastal Command were never bombed. All they had to do was track for submarines. But my uncle Douglas, who was a flight lieutenant, said to his commanding officer, he knew Kenneth, my father, was missing. He said he persuaded his commanding officer, and this is wartime, remember, but to let him fly to Whitton in Huntingdonshire from Iceland, not a pleasure trip, to persuade my father's commander that Dad was still alive. He did this in, I think it was about the 19th of August, 1943. And when he saw father's, when Douglas, my uncle Douglas, saw father's commander, the commander said, "Well, what are you doing here, Ken? You've been shot down." He said, "No, I'm an identical twin." But it's a fact that fraternal identical twins have an affinity. And he said, "I'm telling you, sir, that my brother is alive. He was shot down, but he is alive. And that was relevant because on the 3rd of September, his parents, my father's parents, got a telegram saying that Dad was alive. Fantastic. But that was one thing. The other thing that was significant was, and even now I find it very poignant, Father flew in a Lancaster on the 25th of July, 1943, on a trip to Essen. And on board they had an American Air Force General, Anderson, because the Americans felt that the RAF were having an easy go of bombing at night, because they felt that it was a lot easier than flying fortresses in daylight. Flying fortresses had underneath guns. They were much better armed. And General Anderson went on this trip. My father was the squadron leader, he was the senior officer, but the person who was in charge of the aeroplane was always the pilot. And so they did this trip and they came back, and Father's written somewhere that I saw saying, Anderson said, "This is frightening. When you're in dark and you're seeing flashing lights and bombs and other aircraft being shot down, unbelievably tragic." And that little story, that same bomber, Lancaster bomber, is now at Hendon Air Museum. So Father flew in that on the 25th of July 1943. In March 1980, and this is the poignant thing for me, which comes out, was we managed to get special permission for my father to go in the same aeroplane, in the same seat he sat in 37 years previously. And we have a picture, wonderful, which is in the book.
Yeah, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Yeah.
So there's things that come out, like little stories, like my mother, the officers and squaddies were not allowed to mix, and my mother, they obviously liked each other. My mother went in to see him one day in his office, and one of his subordinates came in and knocked and said, "Squadron leader, I need to see you." My mother had to hide in a cabinet for 45 minutes whilst he was being interviewed.
And carry on RAF.
She was what?
It's carry on RAF.
Yeah. Well, she had hid in the cabinet, but anyway, they did get married. So that was yeah.
That's wonderful. And one thing, going back to the danger aspects as well, when you've been in one of the Lancasters, so have I, and I think the thing that strikes you about them was how vulnerable they were, even when they're on the ground. You tap on the outside shell of the aircraft, and it's millimeters thin, isn't it? It's
the only protection they had in the aircraft was the pilot. They had reinforced steel around the back of the seat and underneath their seat as well. And I know I can say this on this Zoom thing, but they used to take metal balls in and sit on them.
Right.
So they didn't get shrapnel in their bums.
Yes. Yeah, very wise too.
Yes.
But it was so astonishing. Everybody should go on one of the Lancaster airplanes if they just to underline how remarkably brave the people who flew them must have been.
Unbelievable. I mean, at least my father, well, he was the navigator was inside. I think the most dangerous position, which I sat in the Lancaster at East Kirby, was the tail end gunner.
Yeah,
very low position. They used to call them tail end Charlie, and the Germans used to try and take them out. And you couldn't put your parachute on because it was inside the aircraft. So if the aircraft was spinning round, their mortality rates were very high, frightening. Very high. But the whole experience must have been very frightening. I mean, I like you. I went in the one at East Kirby last September, and it's a very small fuselage, very, very small, and you're in this aircraft for 8 hours. 8 hours there, flying 25,000 feet, and it's
freezing
cold. You're being shot at.
Not
very,
pleasant.
Very, very frightening.
Well, the whole project must have been a very, very humbling process for you. I would have thought. What were your own feelings when you completed it? Did it leave you feeling a lot closer to your father?
Yes, absolutely. I felt. Do you know what, Mark? I wrote it for posterity. I wrote it not to make any money. I haven't made any money actually at all, but I wrote it, and now I've finished it. I feel proud, and it's very poignant for me. So my father was a member of the RAF club, but he was very pro the RAF Benevolent Fund. So any profits from the sale of the book will go to the RAF Benevolent Fund. I actually do talks now on it's called "What Did You Do in the War, Dad?" I don't call it Kenneth George Price DFC and Bar. What did you do in the war, Dad? And so any talks that I give to local Rotary, Probus, Women's Institutes, I donate to the RAF Benevolent Fund. So since I started about 18 months ago, I've managed to raise about £560 for the RAF Benevolent Fund, which is fantastic. But I've done it for the family. I've done it for posterity, and even now, talking about it, it's fantastic. I feel really, really proud of my father. Bearing in mind, when he was back in the UK, he was only 26. I've got children, one daughter 23 and son of 18, and father was joined the RAF at the age of 21. So in that 5-6 years, he'd achieved more experiences than most of us do in a lifetime.
Yeah,
absolutely fantastic. So yes, very proud and very poignant for me.
Yes, absolutely. What have you been happy with the reception you've had so far for the finished product as well? No doubt you've circulated it amongst lots of RAF people.
Yes, it's been very good, very good. I did my first print in September 2021. I had a reprint in February. I'm doing another reprint in probably end of this year, which every time I get a reprint, I've got something little bit extra to add, because people have said, "Oh, have you considered this or have you considered that?" But as you know from writing books, you can't change too much, otherwise the whole sequence doesn't work. But the feedback's been fantastic. But surprise, surprise, I live in Henley and Arden, and I think probably 25% of the population have bought a book. But most of my book sales come from my talks. So by coincidence, I do the talk, and then I say, "Oh, by the way, this talk is based on this book." So the feedback has been fantastic, and again, I'm very proud of it. So yeah.
Good. Well, I should point out that it's still available on Amazon as well, isn't it?
It is on Amazon, and it's available direct through me if you can't get it through Amazon. And I think my email details are on the website. In fact, I know they are.
Yeah, that's good. That's good to know. Got time for a couple of questions as well to tag into this. Lady M says, "Did your father say what gave him the strength to survive through those dark days?"
As I said in my interview with Mark, he didn't, but it was quite amazing. When I saw the cards that he'd sent home, he was allowed to send, sorry, I said 100 cards. He was allowed to send 4 or 5 cards home. And one of them, you could see it was the love of my mother and wanting to get back to the cottage in Coventry, which is a pub in Coventry, which apparently still exists. And it was his comrades in the camp. So there was great camaraderie amongst the officer base, but he never spoke to his children about his motivation at the time. I can tell from what he's written that he clearly, after 15-18 months of being in prisoner of war camp, knowing that if he went over, there was a wire, and if he went over that wire, he was shot. So a number of prisoners intentionally committed suicide by going over the wire because they couldn't take it anymore. I mean, if you're in a camp with no communication and you're surrounded by fir trees, it must have been a really frightening experience. So The answer is verbally, he never communicated, but I get the feeling it was because he wanted to get back to meet my mum. Because he said to his parents, which I thought was quite poignant, in a card that wasn't sent to my mum, he said, "Could you destroy all the letters from other girlfriends?" And because he didn't want mum to see them. And so that I think it was motivation. They were very. He was very much in love with her, which is fantastic.
Yeah. Fabulous. Yeah, it's a love story as well.
Yes.
You went out to the site of Stalag Luft III, didn't you? In Poland. What was the atmosphere like of the place? It's not much standing still, but
you can see they've got a replica hut 104, which is where the Great Escape took place from. Identical replica hut. You can see where the camp theatre was. And you can see the site of the tunnel under the camp theatre. Everybody says there are 3 tunnels. Everybody knows of Tom, Dick, and Harry, but there was another one called George, which was underneath the theatre, and they used that for storing sand. But it was it is a pitiless place. It was, when I was there, it was damp. It was miserable. They're about a mile from the station. The station is still in the way it was then. In fact, I stayed in the so-called Sargon hotel, which at the time, my father was in prisoner of war camp. It was their camp hospital, and I slept in one of the beds that was used as a hospital bed then. And I can tell you, it was metal. It's got springs. I had marks on my back, but a very depressing place. And it was miles from anywhere. I mean, it was 100 miles from Berlin. It was 20 miles from the Polish-German border, but it was desolate, surrounded by trees. And the cunning Germans, well, they're clever people. They'd chosen a place that was, but the camp Luft III was built by Polish prisoners of war in 1942, built on sand. Why? So that they could discourage the prisoners of war from digging tunnels. Because if you ever played in the sand, as I used to as a youngster, digging a hole and making it safe was very difficult. So they used, to dig their 3 tunnels, Tom, Dick, and Harry, they used 4,000 bedboards. 4,000 bedboards. They cleared 200 tons of sand, which they had to get rid of, which my father helped disperse through. They had bags in their trousers to try and disperse it, but sand was a different color to the earth, so they had to clear it. And the other thing the Germans did, they built the huts on wood. So the poles, so all the huts were probably 3 or 4 foot off the ground, so they could see if anybody was tunneling. And what the Brits did, what the RF did, they dug the tunnels underneath the stoves. Very clever, incredibly clever. So Harry, H for Harry, the tunnel was dug beneath 25 feet underneath a stove. But I saw crockery there, which I've taken photographs of, not for the book, because that's another story, but taken photographs of crockery that was made in 1943. And you can see it's still scattered around there. Desolate site. Must have been incredibly depressing. But you know, my father in many ways was lucky, because RAF officers were treated better than the Russians or the Poles. And the other thing that the Germans knew was that we had their prisoners at home. So if they did anything to the RAF prisoners, we might do something to the POWs in the UK. The other thing interesting to me was that all the guards were Luftwaffe officers, or Luftwaffe. They were over 50, so they were too old to fight on the front. Colonel von Lindner, who was the camp commandant, was an aide to the Kaiser in the First World War. He was an aide to Goering, and he followed the Geneva Convention. He was a gentleman, and he was absolutely livid when they made this escape. And what Hitler said, right, we're going to shoot you, but they didn't shoot him. What they did, they put him on the Eastern Front facing the Russians, which in itself then was a death sentence.
It was a death sentence. Yeah,
Lindner actually was injured twice, and then he survived until 1965.
Mm.
But he was a gentleman. Just as an aside, I was talking about the Luftwaffe officer who helped rescue my father in August 1943, and in November 1947, father had a letter from the Ministry of Defence from this guy saying, "Dear Squadron Leader Price, you may remember I helped rescue you from the Gestapo in 1943. Would you give me a reference? Because I'm being held by the Canadians on war crimes." He was an SS, Romanian SS officer. Father didn't write on the letter, which I've still got, which is in the book. He just said he told my mother, I'm not responding to this. Why help somebody who tried to con me anyway? So
yeah, I can't say it's a blame.
Yeah, no, that was a very emotional experience, and we had a fly past of a bomber from the Polish Air Force. It wasn't a Lank, but it was a very emotional experience, and because Dad was in the three, I and my sister and my brother-in-law right at the front, which was really fantastic. And in fact, we were taken in the evening to with all the lights out to see what it would have been like to escape, going through fir trees for a mile with no lights, no torches. Horrendous. It must have been frightening.
Yeah, just give you a little taste of. Well, we've all seen the film, and no doubt you watch the film and say, "Well, that didn't happen. That didn't." We know Steve McQueen didn't try to jump over a wire fence in a motorbike or anything like that. But quite a lot of the film was grounded in the truth of it, wasn't it? With the murders.
I would challenge that. I would challenge that because the film is. If you look at the film, it looks to be warm and sunny and nice, whereas actually the escape was -20, snow on the ground. There were no Americans in the Great Escape. Definitely, they only put the 2 Americans in, Steve McQueen, one of them, to help sell it to the American public.
Naturally,
there were Americans in a sister compound, but bear in mind the Americans really only came into the war at the end of 1941, so there were very few prisoners of war, so they hadn't really got involved. After the Great Escape, they got them muddled up a bit, but it was English only. English only. And father did a lot of things. He was involved in bribing German guards with cigarettes and chocolate, which they didn't have. So once you've got a guard bribed, you could bribe them more, because you could say to them, "Well, hey, young man, you've given me some parts for a radio, and you're not going to give me any more. Maybe your commandant would like to know that you're helping me."
Quite.
So, and because of Dad's German fluency, that was helpful. So I've got a map at home, which is a silk map, which was put in a book, and they'd hollowed out the book, which had come via the Red Cross to put for the escapers. There were silk maps, because paper maps would have disintegrated. Silk maps wouldn't have disintegrated, which I thought was quite clever as well.
Absolutely. You mentioned in the book that your father wasn't one of those who was desperately keen to get out on the night of the Great Escape. He was given he had quite a low number, didn't he? Do you know anything about how they decided on the order for escape?
Yes, I do. The 25 who were key people, squadron leader Boschel was one. There were 25 key people who were 1 to 25, and then they drew lots. So my father could have been 26 or 27. Flight Lieutenant Jack Lyons, whom I met in October 2017, was number 78. 76 got out, so he was lucky to survive. So Dad was 182, so he was way down the list. But they drew lots. There was no, you've done a good job. You've been tunneling. Most of the tunnelers were ex-miners for obvious reasons, because they'd have affinity with being claustrophobic, which it must have been, and even tunneling. They had to tunnel naked because they then had to come out, because if the Germans saw sand on their clothes, they know there was a tunneling going on. So they got out and showered immediately after they got back. Cold shower, by the way.
Naturally. Yes, it's astonishing, isn't it? It's absolutely astonishing. And then you're planning to follow up and revise your work as you gain further information. Is that right?
Yes. When every time I talk to people, and particularly like Flight Lieutenant Colin Bell, who's still alive, he'll say to me, have you considered this, or have you considered that? Now, in my talks, I keep getting asked questions on my uncle, Douglas. They say, well, what happened to your uncle? Did he stay at Whitton? The answer is no. He went back to Iceland Coastal Command. My father always said he spent a cushy war there. He survived. He eventually became commandant of Bournemouth Airport, and he lived in Bournemouth. Had one son, so I had a cousin. Sadly, he died. But the stuff I'd like to put in. I'd like to put in a bit more about my mum, but is that relevant to my father's story? Probably not. I've got a picture of my mum at High Wycombe, where I can see her as a stenographer. It's like a glorified typist, I believe. With
a quick typist.
A Bomber Harris at the back. There's a picture of her at the front, and he's standing at the back. And I know we can see it's my mum, but does that detract from the story? I personally, I'm going to probably leave it at that. It's not a story about the Great Escape. It's a story about my father, who took part in the Great Escape, and it's his life. He joined the MOD, Ministry of Defence, and he was one of 5,000 people who, if we'd have been taken part in nuclear bombing, he was one of 5,000 who would have gone underground. But he too was a journalist part-time for the Slough Express. He used to get a penny a line, an old penny a line. But he was
more than I was earning towards the end there. So,
but he was very active in our local community. He was very family orientated. He felt I was a complete waste of space because I was lazy, well, I was lazy, but you learn, and eventually I joined Schweppes, and that's another story. But the book is about my father. People have said, well, you could add more about the Great Escape and told us more. I'm not so sure, actually, Mark. I think there are so many books on the Great Escape. I'm quite knowledgeable on it, and I do two talks. One is what did you do in the war, Dad? And the other one is Stalag Luft III and my visit to it. So, but they're focusing on different aspects. And the Stalag Luft III one talks about the camp and what they did and the privations, and how they survived on Red Cross parcels for food. So I probably won't alter it that much. I should just add bits and tweak it.
Yeah. Well, I think your point about there being so many works on the Great Escape is valid. Because there are plenty of books about the subject itself, but your work is unique because it's about one man. So the more you can find out about that one man and so maybe more about his family.
Yeah, you are maybe. Right. People have said to me I should go to the Imperial War Museum, where there's a lot of records kept on personnel in the RAF, and I'll probably learn a bit more about my dad. When I go to Whitton, I've no doubt I'll learn a lot more about what he did. I mean, I know what squadron he was in, but I'll learn a lot more. But what I'd like to do is build the record of my father rather than Stalag Luft III, The Great Escape, which is all very interesting. But it's what my dad did, and it's because I had a connection. I was 30 6 when Dad died. So, and we were good mates. And there aren't many of my generation, over 70s, dare I say, who have a connection, with parents who fought in the Second World War. I do when I talk to Probus groups. Now, Probus, most of the guys are probably mid-late 60s, early 70s going on, and they're all very interested in the talk, but of course they all want to talk about their own father, and that's understandable. So that's we all have my talk is always about, I said we will all have a story. You could all sit down and write a story on your father or your mother. I happen to have done mine, and it's personal. I'm sorry if it sounds a bit selfish, but I've done it, and this is the story. So that's what I do, and I finish up my talk by showing what book I'm very proud of.
Yes, very much so. Well, that's a great place to finish, actually, Alistair. I was wonderful listening to you.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us in Middleway Words.
Did you have any more questions? I thought I saw a couple of questions pop up. Or right?
Yes, I've put them to you. I've put them to you.
Right.
So yes, that's a full extent of our questions so far, and I think yes, we've covered everything. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for your time. And I've enjoyed, on a personal note, meeting and chatting to you. Perhaps we can, when I go to Turf Moor, perhaps we can have a drink together.
I think so. I think that's a very good idea. Thank you very much, Alistair.
All right, take care. Thank you very much, and thank you for being fantastically professional in interviewing me. You were brilliant.